Until recently, I thought there was only one violin maker in our city's history. That was Frank Farver. He was the builder. He was the grandfather of the Frank Farver we all remember. When he wasn't building houses in the wintertime, he had a great passion for violin making. I'm going to say a little bit more about him in a moment. We came across a violin in our archives about a year ago that I was unaware of. It was made by a Daniel Nellis in 1900, and it wasn't in playing order. And most violinists, when they see a violin, they want to play it. You know, whether it's your stand partner, or you go to a shop and you want to play these instruments. And that was no different in this case. I mentioned it to Dean Katahira, and we had it put in working order, and we played it, and we thought, gee, this would make a nice mini program. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk about a little bit about the history of violins, and then Mary Brandt's going to tell us about Daniel Nellis, and Dean Katahira is going to play the instrument, which is right here. I'm going to refer to this occasionally, and then when I get to just a real rough, fast overview of how you make a violin, that's what we'll do with this. The early violin history is really quite old. The idea of bowed stringed instruments goes back to the Middle Ages. In the Middle East, they migrate to the West, first in the Balkans and then in Southern Europe, principally Northern Italy. And the first recognizable violin was made by Andrea Amati in 1564. He and his descendants continue to develop the violin. In the mid-1600s, you see the rise of the Guarneri family. And then later in the 1600s, Antonio Stradivari appears. And these three families are working in Cremona. And they are responsible for the violin shape we know today. We live in a golden age of violin making right now. And these shapes and designs are still being used today. We haven't been able to improve upon something that was developed 300, 350 years ago. Not only are these violins perfect in their design, at least we can't improve upon them. With all the technology we have, we still don't know why they sound as good as they do. It's true that beauty is in the ear of the listener, and it's generally agreed that Guarneri del Gesù, who was the last of the Guarneri family, he dies in 1744, and Antonio Stradivari, who dies in 1737, make the best instruments in the world. The Guarneri maybe even is a little bit better. And Dean has a wonderful story to go along with that. I'll let him tell that story. It's quite spectacular. So this creates a demand for very few instruments. These instruments sell for many millions of dollars. There are only about a little over 400 Strads left in the world, and about half as many Guarneri del Gesùs. Del Gesù means of Jesus. His father's name was Giuseppe also. And to distinguish himself from his father, he added IHS in his labels. When you look inside, these are called the F-holes of a violin. If you look in here, there's a label. And he signed his label, Giuseppe Guarneri, IHS, Jesus, Savior of Mankind. So he became known as Del Gesù. Now this violin, too, is no different than others made because it's patterned after a Giuseppe Guarneri of 1690. That would have been the father. Now these violins are so valuable, so rare, they're owned by philanthropists, insurance companies, banks, and they're loaned out to really deserving musicians, but there aren't enough to go around, and it creates quite a socioeconomic problem for really good players of, say, the collegiate level. And so researchers have been trying to find out what the magic was of these early instruments. And with all the research capabilities we have, we still don't really know. The current wisdom seems to be that if you take an instrument that is well and accurately made, and with time and playing, that sound will develop. I had that experience with a new instrument I had in 1994. And in 8 years, all of a sudden, it just blossomed. And you would expect that it would continue to do that through time. But so there's no quick way we can make good instruments. But they keep coming up with new theories. I mean, it's the treatment of the wood, the varnish. You know, makers today insist on, or many of them do, insist on buying the spruce tops from the Italian Alps, grown at a certain elevation on the north slope of these mountains. You know, they just don't want to leave anything to chance. There's a number of variables, and this one they want to eliminate. The maple that you see in the back, the ribs, these are called the ribs, the neck, the scroll, that comes from the Balkans. I mean, we have perfectly good maple in Wisconsin, but people are maybe superstitious and want to start with wood from where these Cremonese makers found the wood. Okay, I think it's one of the great mysteries of the world, though, to have something that old, that valuable, and we can't duplicate it. Now, it's true, there are exceptions. I mean, there's a great German violinist who's playing on a brand new instrument, and there are many violinists who play on 19th century instruments. It's not just Strads and Guarneris. Okay, I want to just quickly go over this sheet with you. This is now looking at the top picture on page 1 shows some wood that's drying. And this might be either spruce for the tops or maple for the backs. And this may rest in an open air shed covered for years and years. The ends are covered with wax so that those blocks of wood don't dry out too fast. They'll be split again, and then the thick end will be fitted together and glued. By the way, the glue is a hide glue. In a violin, you know that wood moves. With temperature and humidity, there are stresses that get created. Now, if these stresses build, it could split the wood, and you don't want to do that. So with a hide glue, the glue lets go. And it's quite common to have a seam open up, and it's quite easy to glue that back in place. It's also easy to repair a split in the wood, but that's more complicated and time-consuming, and it may affect the playing of the instrument. Okay, in the bottom picture you see some molds. Now those are called internal molds. The violin is constructed in such a way that we add the ribs around the perimeter of that mold first before we do the top and the top plate and the bottom plate. Now those molds, as you could probably guess, really go way back in time, and those are established shapes. They look like there's some viola molds in the center there. That's a slightly larger instrument. It's 5 notes lower than the violin. It's held in the same way, but it has a deeper sound. The top of page 2, you can see that mold. There are some little corner blocks now placed in there. Now, these are usually made of willow or poplar, and that would be in the corners here. This is called a C-bout. It's here and here, and then the top and the bottom. And then those get cut to fit the shape of the perimeter of the mold, the top and the bottom. The ones on the sides, the 4 on the sides, get cut to a point. In the bottom picture on page 2, you can see now a rib being glued in place. And that rib it's very thin. It's made of maple. It's probably the thickness of a dime, maybe even thinner than a dime. Let's see, top of page 3. Well, take a look at the bottom of page 3 first. Here is a very tricky stage. These are photos of a top or a bottom plate being carved. And you use a gouge to rough shape the arching of the violin. If you notice, this is not flat like a guitar. See how it's bulged up on the top and on the back? And then if you look down, it goes this way as well as this way. Those are established shapes, and instrument makers have experimented with a lot of different shapes. And the templates that you follow to make sure you're following a correct arching is shown above on page 3. In the bottom picture on page 3, there's I'll call a little thumb plane. They're little brass planes that take the rough gouge marks down. And then in the next page, there's 2 pictures in the top. You'll see there's a scraper being used to further smooth the surface of the plates. You don't use sandpaper, you use a metal scraper. In the top picture there, you'll see a micrometer being used to gauge the thickness. One thing you can't do is add wood. If you've cut too deeply, you're all done. So it's very critical. And the shapes, or pardon me, the thicknesses vary throughout the top plate. They've discovered that a little thicker material in the center, and as opposed to the edges, help create a better sound. So it varies throughout the instrument. And that was one of the secrets that makers for many centuries didn't understand, that there was this thickness difference. When you get to the final tuning of the violin, you even reach in these F holes with what looks like a hole. And you will scrape just minute quantities of the material away to get a balance of the thicknesses in the right places. On the bottom of page 4, you can see, you'd think this would be cut rather quickly, but no, it's hand carved. The scroll, the neck, and this is really time consuming. And that's done with a gouge, and then smaller and smaller gouges to get the surface smooth. By the way, this Guarneri del Gesù, toward the end of his life, his work got real sloppy. He didn't care about aesthetics at all. You can see his gouge marks. He worked really fast, and he only lived to be 46. Maybe he knew that. So he was really a rough worker. The purfling, which you see on the side here, that's on the top and the back, there's a thin two strips of ebony and maybe pear wood in between. They use different materials. But that reinforces the edge. Well, he jammed it in, looked like he used a hammer. And yet, so these instruments are worth many millions of dollars. So he didn't care about that. And then the next picture on top of page 5, you can see there's tiny little gouges used to cut out the peg box here. That the pegs go through this box. That's hollowed out. And the bottom on page 5, there's a picture of varnishing. It was long thought that varnishing was the secret to good sound, but that's somewhat discounted. Top of page 6, you can see there the final fitting of the pegs. I mean, there are lots of little things you have to do at the end, fitting the tailpiece, the bridge, the pegs. Inside the violin, there's what's called a sound post and a bass bar. These things are critical to how the violin works. I won't take an extra 15 minutes to explain that. And the last picture there I thought was kind of interesting. That is a picture of young Frank holding a violin that his grandfather made in front of my house, which Frank's grandfather built. And these guys were there working on the roof. I've had a chance to see this violin that Frank is holding. It's now being used by his granddaughter in upstate New York. She's a high school student. She loves it. And so for that reason, we can't get it. There was another violin I saw that was owned by Ed Klingbeil. Frank and Ed were, I think, cousins. And this violin of Ed Klingbeil's was made by Frank's grandfather also. And where that violin is, I don't know. I tried to find it for our presentation this afternoon. Just one last comment about Frank's grandfather's work. He was clearly self-taught. The work is not real clean when you compare it to this. In fact, I thought this violin was even a workshop instrument. When I say workshop, that means the workload is divided up among many workers. One person might be making necks and scrolls all day long, so they get pretty good at it. Whereas this instrument, no, according to the man who actually got it in playing order, said no, there are signs of it being made by one man and handmade, not something in a factory or an assembly line. Okay, I want to turn it over now to Mary Brandt, who will tell us who Daniel Nellis was.